People used to say the old woman at the edge of town was hiding monsters in the woods, but the night the forest caught fire, she was the one who saved us all. The wolf started howling a little after midnight. At first, nobody paid much attention. Strange sounds coming from the northern woods had become part of life in our small Montana town ever since Eleanor Hayes moved into the old cabin near the tree line. Some people said she had lost her mind after losing her husband years ago. Others whispered that she cared more about animals than human beings. Parents warned their children not to wander too close to her property, especially after rumors spread that she was keeping wild animals behind the fences near her garden. But that night, the howling didn't stop. It rolled through the pine trees again and again, sharp and desperate enough to wake sleeping dogs across town. Eleanor opened her eyes inside the tiny bedroom of her wooden cabin and sat up slowly. The old floor creaked beneath her feet as she walked toward the front window. At 72 years old, her joints often ached during cold nights, but something about the sound outside made her chest tighten. The little wolf she had rescued months ago stood near the porch, pacing frantically through the grass. Its silver fur glowed beneath the moonlight as it lifted its head and howled once more toward the northern ridge. Eleanor pulled her sweater tighter around her shoulders and opened the front door. The smell hit her first. Smoke. Thick and bitter. Then she saw it. Far beyond the dark rows of pine trees, an orange glow flickered against the night sky. The fire was still miles away, but strong summer winds were already pushing sparks through the forest faster than anyone could have imagined. For one frozen second, Eleanor simply stood there listening to the distant crackling carried through the trees. Then the wolf let out another cry and ran toward the road. "Oh Lord," Eleanor whispered under her breath. She didn't stop to grab anything except an old flashlight hanging beside the door. Not the framed photo of her son sitting near the fireplace. Not the worn quilt folded across her chair. Not even the small wooden box that held her late husband's wedding ring. She hurried down the gravel path as fast as her legs would carry her while the wolf ran circles around her feet. The town was still asleep when she reached the first house. Eleanor pounded against the front door with both hands. "Wake up," she shouted. "There's a fire coming through the woods." Porch lights flickered on one by one as confused families stepped outside in their robes and slippers. The wolf continued howling beside her, the sound echoing through the quiet streets like an alarm siren cutting through the darkness. Soon doors were opening all across town. Parents carried sleepy children into trucks. Elderly couples helped each other down porch steps. Young men rushed toward the northern field with shovels and tractors, trying to clear dry brush before the flames could spread farther. Smoke slowly swallowed the stars overhead while Eleanor moved from house to house, coughing from the heat and exhaustion but refusing to stop. Hours later, when the fire crews finally gained control of the blaze near sunrise, the entire town stood silently near the highway watching black smoke drift into the pale morning sky. Their homes had been spared. Their families were safe. But at the very edge of town, near the forest Eleanor had spent years protecting, her little wooden cabin had almost completely burned away. By late morning, most of the smoke had begun to drift away from the valley, but the smell of burned wood still hung heavily in the summer air. Eleanor sat silently on the tailgate of an old pickup truck parked near the highway while firefighters moved through the remains of her property. Ash covered the grass where her garden used to be. The wooden fences behind the cabin had collapsed during the night, and the little animal shelters she had built over the years were now nothing more than blackened frames scattered across the ground. A few rescued animals had survived because neighbors managed to open some of the gates before the fire spread too close, but others had not been as lucky. Eleanor did not cry in front of anyone. She simply kept her hands folded in her lap while watching smoke rise from the ruins of the only home she had known for nearly 30 years. People moved around her quietly, almost carefully, as if they suddenly did not know what to say to the woman they had spent years avoiding. Children clung to their parents while staring at the old woman near the road. Some of those same children had once pressed their faces against Eleanor's fence just to catch a glimpse of the rabbits hopping through her garden or the tiny owls resting beneath the pine branches behind her porch. Eleanor could still remember the first time she noticed them standing there years ago. At first, it had only been two little boys holding rusty bicycles near the end of the gravel road. They had looked nervous when Eleanor stepped outside carrying a bucket of water for an injured deer resting near the shed. Most adults in town avoided eye contact with her entirely, but children were different. Children were curious. One of the boys had pointed toward the deer and quietly asked if it was dangerous. Eleanor remembered shaking her head softly before kneeling beside the animal. "Only scared," she had answered. After that, more children started coming. Sometimes they arrived after school carrying pieces of lettuce or apples from their kitchens. Other times they simply stood outside the fence whispering excitedly while squirrels darted through the trees overhead. Eleanor never invited them inside the yard, but slowly she stopped asking them to leave. The silence surrounding her little cabin began to change after that. On warm afternoons, she could hear children laughing while tiny rabbits chased each other through the grass behind the garden. Some days, a little girl with braided blonde hair would sit near the fence for nearly an hour watching an injured owl practice stretching its wings. Eleanor often stayed quiet during those moments, but deep inside, the sound of children near the house eased something painful she had carried for years. Before Samuel became sick, her son used to fill the cabin with that same kind of energy. He had loved every living creature he found in the woods. Stray dogs. Injured birds. Even turtles pulled from the roadside after storms. Eleanor still remembered one rainy afternoon when Samuel came running through the front door carrying a soaked raccoon kit wrapped inside his jacket. He could not have been older than 10. "He just needs somewhere safe tonight," Samuel had said while trembling from the cold rain outside. Eleanor smiled faintly at the memory before lowering her eyes toward the ashes covering the ground. Near the burned remains of the porch, she spotted the twisted metal frame of Samuel's old bicycle lying half-buried beneath blackened wood. For a long moment, she stared at it without speaking. Then quietly, almost too softly for anyone nearby to hear, Eleanor whispered, "I am sorry, sweetheart. I could not protect your dream." The town changed quietly after the fire. Nobody held community meetings about Eleanor Hayes. Nobody stood in the streets apologizing for years of whispers and suspicion. But little things began to happen that had never happened before. On the third morning after the fire, Eleanor arrived at the temporary trailer the county had provided near the highway and found fresh bread sitting beside her door wrapped carefully in a kitchen towel. There was no note attached. The next afternoon, someone left 2 large bags of animal feed near the steps. A few days later, several teenagers showed up carrying lumber in the back of an old pickup truck. They did not say much. They simply asked where she wanted the new fences built. Eleanor still moved slowly through her days as though part of her remained standing inside the ashes of the burned cabin. Every evening, she walked toward the edge of the blackened clearing where the pine forest began and stared silently at what remained of her garden. The wolf followed close behind her now, limping slightly on its injured leg but refusing to leave her side. People no longer crossed the street to avoid them. In fact, children had started appearing again. At first, they stood quietly near the roadside, unsure whether they were still welcome. Eleanor noticed them one afternoon while sitting on an overturned bucket sorting through a box of rescue blankets. A little boy wearing a baseball cap stepped forward carefully and held out a small mason jar filled with carrots. "For the rabbits," he said nervously. Eleanor looked at the jar for several seconds before finally accepting it with both hands. "Thank you," she answered softly. The boy smiled with relief before hurrying back toward the others waiting near their bicycles. By the following weekend, more people came. Some helped clear fallen wood. Others repaired damaged animal pens. Eleanor could hardly believe it when old Mr. Grady, who had once argued at a town meeting that wild animals did not belong near children, spent nearly 2 hours rebuilding part of the garden fence beside her. He worked quietly the entire time except for one moment near sunset when he leaned against the hammer in his hand and looked out toward the burned trees. "You saved my granddaughter that night," he said without meeting Eleanor's eyes. "I do not think I ever thanked you properly." Eleanor lowered her gaze toward the dirt beneath her boots. "Anybody would have done the same," she replied. Mr. Grady shook his head slowly. "No, ma'am," he said. "Not everybody would have." A week later, another visitor arrived at the temporary shelter. She was a tall woman in her late 60s with silver hair tied neatly beneath a straw hat and calm green eyes that seemed to notice everything around her. She introduced herself as Clara Whitmore, a retired veterinarian from a neighboring county. Eleanor recognized the name immediately. Clara had spent decades caring for farm animals and wildlife across northern Montana. People still spoke about her with enormous respect. Clara crouched near the wolf resting beneath the shade of a folding chair and studied its injured leg carefully before looking back toward Eleanor. "You did a decent job treating him," she said gently. Eleanor gave a faint shrug. "I only did what I could." Clara smiled softly at that answer. That is usually how the best people begin. Over the next hour, Clara walked slowly around the property examining the remaining animal shelters and asking thoughtful questions about Eleanor's routines. She never spoke to Eleanor like she was strange or foolish. Instead, she spoke with the quiet understanding of someone who had spent a lifetime caring for injured creatures herself. Before leaving, Clara paused beside the trailer steps and looked toward the distant tree line glowing gold beneath the evening sun. "This place does not need to disappear," she said. "It just needs help becoming what it was always meant to be." Construction on the new shelters began slowly as summer moved toward early fall. The county cleared part of the burned land near the old cabin while volunteers from town continued arriving almost every morning carrying tools, paint buckets, fencing wire, and stacks of lumber tied down in pickup trucks. Eleanor still found it difficult to believe that people were willing to help her at all. For years, most of them had looked at her property with suspicion. Now those same people stood beneath the pine trees rebuilding it piece by piece. Clara Whitmore became part of Eleanor's daily routine almost immediately. Every morning around 8 o'clock, her old green station wagon rolled down the gravel road carrying boxes of medical supplies and bags of feed in the back. Clara moved through the temporary animal pens with calm confidence, gently checking wounds, changing bandages, and teaching Eleanor safer ways to handle frightened wildlife. Eleanor listened carefully to everything she said. She had spent years relying mostly on instinct and patience while caring for injured animals, but Clara brought knowledge that transformed the entire place. Soon the small rescue area behind the property started feeling less like an improvised shelter and more like something organized and permanent. One cloudy afternoon, while Clara examined an injured hawk beneath the shade of a tarp canopy, a young man arrived carrying a toolbox in one hand and a dented metal coffee thermos in the other. He introduced himself as Noah Bennett. Eleanor recognized him vaguely as the grandson of the woman who used to own the grocery store downtown. He looked to be in his mid-20s, tall and thin with tired blue eyes and work boots covered in sawdust. "Mr. Grady said you needed help rebuilding some of the animal enclosures," he explained quietly. Eleanor nodded toward the damaged fencing near the tree line. "Most of it still needs work," she answered. Noah set down his toolbox and got started almost immediately. Unlike many volunteers who stayed an hour or two before heading home, Noah remained until sunset. Over the following days, he kept returning. Sometimes he repaired broken gates. Other times he rebuilt feeding stations or reinforced wooden beams beneath the larger shelters. He worked quietly, rarely speaking unless spoken to first, but Eleanor noticed how gentle he was around the animals. One evening she found him sitting cross-legged beside an injured fox kit, patiently holding out pieces of boiled chicken until the frightened creature finally ate from his hand. "You have done this before," Eleanor observed from the porch. Noah smiled faintly without looking up. "Not really," he admitted. I just know what it feels like to be scared of people. Eleanor studied him silently after that. There was sadness in the young man that reminded her of something familiar. A few days later, while the two of them repaired fencing together near the edge of the woods, Noah finally explained. Years earlier, he had owned an orange tabby cat named Oliver that followed him everywhere. The cat disappeared one winter night during a heavy snowstorm and never returned. Noah had searched for weeks through the woods surrounding town. Sounds silly now, he said with an embarrassed laugh while tightening a bolt into the fence post. But after that, I never wanted another pet again. Losing him hurt more than I expected. Eleanor rested both hands on the wooden fence and looked out toward the trees swaying gently in the evening wind. Love always hurts when it leaves, she said softly. That does not make it a mistake. Noah glanced toward her with quiet surprise, as though nobody had ever answered his grief so simply before. As the days passed, Eleanor noticed something else changing around the property. People no longer arrived only to help rebuild. Some came because they genuinely wanted to stay. Children returned after school carrying apples and birdseed. Elderly couples brought folding chairs and sat quietly beneath the trees watching rescued rabbits hop through the grass. Even the wolf had become calmer around strangers, often resting beside the rebuilt porch while families walked carefully through the sanctuary grounds. For the first time in many years, the old clearing near the forest no longer felt lonely. By October, the rebuilt sanctuary looked nothing like the burned clearing people remembered from the summer fire. Fresh cedar fences stretched beneath the tall pine trees, small wooden shelters stood neatly along the property line, and narrow gravel paths wound through patches of wildflowers that local families had planted together during weekends. Every morning, the air smelled faintly of pine needles, coffee, and hay warming beneath the Montana sun. Eleanor still woke before sunrise out of habit. She liked the quiet hours before visitors arrived, when the world felt soft and still beneath the pale blue morning sky. She would carry metal buckets of feed across the sanctuary grounds while the animals slowly stirred awake around her. Rabbits rustled through the grass near the garden fence. Birds fluttered between branches overhead. The wolf usually followed several feet behind her, calm and watchful now, no longer the frightened creature she had pulled from a trap deep in the woods months earlier. Clara often arrived shortly after dawn carrying thermoses of herbal tea and notebooks filled with feeding schedules and treatment plans. She and Eleanor had settled into an easy rhythm together. They rarely wasted words, but their quiet companionship filled the sanctuary with a sense of steadiness Eleanor had not felt in years. Noah, meanwhile, became impossible to separate from the place entirely. Some mornings he appeared before Eleanor even stepped outside, already repairing gates or sweeping leaves from the gravel paths while soft classic rock played quietly from an old radio balanced near the tool shed. Eleanor noticed the way visitors naturally gravitated toward him. Children followed him around asking questions about the animals while older couples often stopped to chat with him near the garden benches he had built from reclaimed wood. One chilly afternoon, Noah stood beside the porch tightening screws into a wooden railing while watching several families wander peacefully through the sanctuary. A little girl laughed as a rescued goat gently nudged her coat pocket searching for carrots. Nearby, an elderly man sat beneath the trees with closed eyes listening to birdsong drifting through the forest. Noah wiped sawdust from his hands and glanced toward Eleanor, who was filling bowls with grain near the chicken enclosure. You know, he said thoughtfully, people do not just come here for the animals anymore. Eleanor looked up. What do you mean? Noah leaned against the railing and studied the sanctuary grounds for a moment before answering. This place makes people feel calmer. Like they can breathe again. Eleanor remained quiet while listening to distant wind move through the pine branches overhead. Noah hesitated before continuing. I have been thinking maybe we could build something small near the entrance. Nothing fancy. Just a place where visitors could sit for coffee or tea after walking through the sanctuary. Eleanor frowned slightly. A café? Noah nodded carefully. A quiet one. Eleanor looked uncertain immediately. For years, she had protected the land behind her home from becoming too crowded or noisy. Even now, after everything that had changed, part of her feared losing the peaceful atmosphere Samuel had once loved so much. "I do not want this place turning into some tourist attraction," she said softly. Noah smiled faintly. "Neither do I." He stepped down from the porch and walked toward the fence where the wolf rested beneath a patch of autumn sunlight. "But maybe people need places like this more than we realize," he said. "If this sanctuary could help wounded animals heal, maybe it can help tired people heal too." Eleanor lowered her eyes after hearing those words. For several seconds, she said nothing at all. Then her gaze drifted toward the old bicycle frame hanging beside the rebuilt shed. Samuel used to dream about creating a place where every frightened or abandoned creature could feel safe. As a little boy, he never separated people from animals when he talked about kindness. To him, all lonely things deserved comfort. Eleanor felt something warm tighten quietly in her chest. Finally, she gave the smallest nod. "All right," she whispered. "But we keep it peaceful." Noah grinned for the first time in days, and somewhere behind them, the wolf lifted its head toward the forest breeze while golden leaves drifted softly across the sanctuary paths. The café opened quietly during the first week of November. There was no grand celebration, no advertisements in town, and no bright signs along the highway inviting crowds to stop by. Eleanor preferred it that way. Noah simply hung a modest wooden board near the gravel entrance with hand-painted letters that read "The Forest Café." Beneath the sign, Clara placed several pots of dark red mums beside the walkway, and by sunrise the following morning, the small café near the sanctuary officially became part of the town. The building itself had once been an old storage shed near the tree line. Noah spent nearly 3 weeks transforming it into something warm and inviting. He sanded every wooden wall by hand, repaired the cracked windows, and built sturdy tables from reclaimed cedar collected after the fire. Soft yellow string lights stretched across the porch roof, glowing gently against the dark pine forest surrounding the property. Inside, the café smelled like cinnamon, coffee, and fresh pine wood. Clara contributed jars of herbal tea blends made from mint, chamomile, and wild lavender growing near the forest trails, while several older women from town baked pies, oatmeal cookies, and homemade bread each morning before sunrise. Eleanor mostly watched everything unfold with quiet disbelief. For so many years, silence had filled her days. Now the sanctuary carried the gentle sounds of conversation almost constantly. Visitors arrived slowly at first. A young couple from town stopped by one afternoon after hearing about the rescued animals from their daughter's teacher. An elderly truck driver passing through the county wandered into the café for coffee and ended up sitting beside the fence for nearly an hour watching birds flutter between the trees. Then more people came. Families from neighboring towns drove north on weekends after hearing rumors about the peaceful little sanctuary hidden near the forest. Some visitors spent time feeding rescued rabbits beside the garden while others simply sat quietly beneath the pine trees with warm mugs resting between their hands. What surprised Eleanor most was how naturally people lowered their voices after arriving there. Nobody shouted. Nobody rushed. Even children seemed calmer within the sanctuary grounds, as though the forest itself encouraged gentleness. One rainy afternoon, Eleanor carried a tray of tea mugs toward the porch tables while soft jazz music drifted from the old radio Noah had placed near the window. A woman sitting alone near the railing looked up at Eleanor with tired eyes and gave a small smile. "I have not slept properly in months," the woman admitted softly while staring toward the sanctuary paths. "But sitting here today feels like my chest can finally relax." Eleanor did not know how to respond at first. She simply nodded quietly and glanced toward the wolf sleeping peacefully near the fence line. More than once, she noticed visitors sitting silently with tears in their eyes while watching injured animals recover beneath the trees. A teenage boy struggling with anxiety began volunteering every Saturday morning cleaning feeding stations. An elderly widower started spending afternoons reading books beneath the cedar benches Noah had built beside the owl enclosure. Little by little, the sanctuary stopped being only a place for rescued animals. It became a place where lonely people found comfort too. One evening after closing the café, Noah and Eleanor stood together near the porch while golden sunset light filtered through the pine branches overhead. The sanctuary had grown quiet again except for the distant rustling of leaves and the soft sound of birds settling into nests for the night. Noah leaned against the railing and looked out across the property with tired satisfaction. "You know," he said softly, "I almost moved to Seattle last year." Eleanor glanced toward him with mild surprise. Noah laughed quietly. "I had a job offer there. Better money. Bigger opportunities." He paused before looking back toward the cafe windows glowing warmly against the darkening forest. "But I think I would have been miserable." Eleanor studied his face carefully for a moment before speaking. "Sometimes people spend years searching for meaning somewhere far away," she said gently. "Then one day they realize it was waiting for them close to home all along." Noah smiled at that, and somewhere nearby, the wolf lifted its head toward the fading sunlight while warm laughter drifted softly from inside the cafe. Winter arrived gently that year. Snow settled softly across the sanctuary grounds, covering the pine branches and wooden fences in quiet layers of white while warm yellow light spilled from the cafe windows each evening. The Forest Cafe had become part of daily life for people across the county. Some visitors arrived before work for coffee and silence beneath the trees. Others drove nearly an hour just to spend an afternoon sitting beside the sanctuary paths listening to birds and wind move through the forest. Eleanor still found it strange sometimes to hear laughter near the old property after so many years of loneliness. Yet now, instead of fearing the sounds, she welcomed them. Every morning she prepared trays of fresh biscuits, oatmeal, and warm tea while Noah opened the cafe before sunrise. Clara often sat near the front window organizing medical charts for the animals while soft jazz music drifted through the wooden building from the old radio beside the counter. The sanctuary no longer felt like a hidden corner of sadness tucked behind the woods. It felt alive. One snowy Saturday afternoon, Eleanor stepped outside carrying a bucket of feed toward the deer enclosure and noticed several children gathered around the wolf near the fence line. The animal rested calmly in the snow while the children spoke to it in hushed voices as though sitting beside an old friend. Years ago, the sight would have terrified most adults in town. Now parents stood nearby smiling quietly while sipping coffee from paper cups stamped with the small cedar tree logo Noah designed for the cafe. Eleanor paused for a moment watching the scene unfold beneath the falling snow. Sometimes life changed so slowly people hardly noticed it happening at all. Other times, it changed all at once. Later that evening, after the sanctuary closed for the night, Noah remained behind cleaning tables while Eleanor stacked mugs beside the sink. Outside, snowflakes drifted lazily beneath the porch lights. "You should see this," Noah said suddenly from near the register counter. Eleanor walked over slowly while drying her hands on a kitchen towel. Noah turned the small laptop screen toward her. Someone had posted photographs of the sanctuary online earlier that week. Images of rescued owls perched beside snowy branches. Rabbits hopping through the winter grass. Families sitting quietly around outdoor fire pits near the cafe. Thousands of people had already viewed the pictures. Messages filled the screen beneath them. Some visitors described the sanctuary as peaceful. Others called it healing. One woman wrote that visiting the sanctuary after losing her husband was the first time she had felt calm in over a year. Eleanor stared silently at the screen for several seconds. "I never expected any of this," she admitted quietly. Noah smiled while closing the laptop. "Neither did I." The wind rattled gently against the windows while the cafe settled into evening silence around them. Eleanor looked toward the sanctuary outside where warm lights glowed faintly between snow-covered trees. For the first time in many years, she realized she was no longer simply surviving each day. She was building something lasting. A few days before Christmas, the town organized a small gathering at the sanctuary. Nothing elaborate. Just neighbors bringing homemade soup, pies, and blankets while children decorated pine trees near the entrance with handmade wooden ornaments shaped like foxes, owls, rabbits, and wolves. Clara hung tiny lanterns throughout the garden paths while Noah built outdoor fire pits where families gathered beneath the stars drinking hot cider and roasted marshmallows. Eleanor stood near the porch wrapped in her old wool coat while watching snowflakes drift through the glowing lights overhead. Nearby, the wolf rested peacefully beside a group of laughing children while soft music floated through the trees from the café radio. Noah walked over carrying 2 mugs of hot tea and handed one carefully to Eleanor. "Samuel would have loved this place," he said gently. Eleanor lowered her eyes toward the steam rising from the cup in her hands. For a moment, emotion tightened painfully in her chest. Then she looked out across the sanctuary once more. Families smiling beneath the pine trees. Animals safe and warm inside the shelters. Lonely people finding comfort beside one another in the quiet forest light. Eleanor smiled softly through tears she no longer tried to hide. "I think," she whispered carefully, "he finally found it." Spring arrived slowly after the long Montana winter, and with it came a kind of quiet beauty Eleanor had not noticed in years. Snow melted from the sanctuary paths one patch at a time, revealing green grass beneath the pine trees while tiny wildflowers began blooming near the fences. Every morning, sunlight spilled softly across the sanctuary grounds as birds returned to the forest in large numbers, filling the air with song before the café even opened. Eleanor liked walking through the property alone during those early hours. The world felt peaceful then, untouched by noise or hurry. She would stop beside each enclosure checking fresh water bowls while the animals slowly woke around her. Rabbits stretched beneath the warm sunlight. Deer wandered calmly near the tree line. The wolf followed close behind her as always, older and stronger now, though still gentle around visitors. Some mornings Eleanor almost forgot how frightened people once were of him. The sanctuary had grown far beyond anything Eleanor ever imagined possible. Noah eventually expanded the café porch after visitors began filling every table on weekends. Clara organized educational programs for children about caring for injured wildlife and respecting the natural world around them. Volunteers now arrived from neighboring counties offering help with feeding schedules, cleaning duties, and repairs. Yet despite all the growth, the sanctuary somehow remained peaceful. People still lowered their voices naturally when entering the property, as though kindness itself lived quietly beneath the pine trees. One warm afternoon in late April, Eleanor stood near the garden fence watching several children release rehabilitated songbirds back into the forest under Clara's supervision. The birds fluttered upward into the bright blue sky while the children clapped excitedly beneath the trees. Nearby, Noah handed fresh lemonade to visitors sitting outside the café while soft jazz drifted through the open windows. Eleanor smiled faintly as she watched the scene unfold. There had been a time when this land held nothing except grief and silence. Now it carried life everywhere she looked. Later that evening, after most visitors had gone home, Eleanor sat alone near the edge of the sanctuary beside the old bicycle frame Noah had carefully restored and mounted beneath a cedar shelter near the garden. Samuel's bicycle no longer looked broken or abandoned. Noah had cleaned the rust from the metal and polished the faded handlebars until they almost gleamed beneath the hanging lantern light. Eleanor often sat there quietly after sunset thinking about her son. Not with the crushing sorrow she once carried every day, but with something softer now. A peaceful ache instead of emptiness. Footsteps approached gently across the gravel path behind her. Noah sat down beside Eleanor holding 2 mugs of warm tea in his hands. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The forest breeze moved softly through the trees overhead while crickets chirped somewhere beyond the sanctuary fence. "You know," Noah said eventually, "people talk about this place everywhere now." Eleanor gave a small smile. "I still do not fully understand why." Noah looked out toward the glowing cafe windows where Clara laughed with several volunteers inside. Because places like this are rare, he answered quietly. Most people spend their whole lives feeling rushed, lonely, or exhausted. Then they come here and remember what calm feels like again. Eleanor lowered her eyes toward the tea warming her hands. For years after Samuel died, she believed grief had permanently separated her from the rest of the world. She thought loneliness was simply something she deserved to carry forever. But sitting there beneath the pine trees, surrounded by life and laughter and healing, she slowly realized something else. Love had not disappeared after loss. It had simply changed shape. The kindness Samuel carried as a little boy had spread quietly through this sanctuary into the lives of strangers Eleanor would never fully know. Families now found comfort here. Lonely people found peace here. Injured creatures found safety here. Even Noah, who once planned to leave town forever, had found purpose here. Eleanor looked toward the old bicycle beneath the lantern light and smiled through tears shining softly in her eyes. "You did it, sweetheart," she whispered beneath the evening breeze. "You built it after all." Years later, people still talked about the sanctuary near the northern forest as though it were something almost magical hidden quietly beyond the edge of town. Travelers passing through Montana often stopped after hearing stories about the peaceful café surrounded by rescued animals and towering pine trees. Some visitors came searching for comfort after difficult seasons in their lives. Others arrived simply because they needed silence for a little while. No matter why they came, most of them left differently than when they arrived. Eleanor Hayes never considered herself remarkable. Even after everything that happened, she still preferred simple routines over attention. Each morning she woke before sunrise, brewed fresh coffee inside the cafe kitchen, and walked slowly through the sanctuary grounds greeting every animal the same way she always had. She still carried feed buckets herself even when Noah insisted she should rest more often now that she was getting older. She still paused beside the wolf every morning to scratch gently behind its ears while it leaned calmly against her leg beneath the pine trees. And every evening before sunset, Eleanor still visited Samuel's restored bicycle near the garden shelter. Some habits became part of a person's soul forever. The sanctuary continued growing over time, though not in loud or extravagant ways. Noah expanded the walking trails deeper into the woods where visitors could sit quietly beside small streams and watch deer wander through the trees at dusk. Clara eventually trained younger volunteers to help care for injured wildlife so the sanctuary could continue long into the future. Families returned year after year, bringing children who once visited the sanctuary when they were small and now brought their own children to experience the same peaceful forest paths and gentle animals. One warm summer evening, Eleanor stood outside the cafe watching golden sunlight drift through the trees while visitors slowly wandered toward the parking area after another quiet day. Laughter floated softly through the air near the garden benches. Somewhere deeper in the sanctuary, an owl called out as the forest settled toward dusk. Noah walked onto the porch carrying 2 mugs of tea and handed one carefully to Eleanor before leaning against the railing beside her. "Busy day," he said with a tired smile. Eleanor nodded while watching several children wave goodbye to the wolf near the fence line. "A good one," she answered softly. For a while, neither of them spoke. The evening breeze carried the scent of pine needles and wildflowers across the sanctuary grounds while warm cafe lights glowed behind them through the windows. Eleanor looked out toward the walking trails disappearing gently into the forest and felt something she once believed she would never feel again. Peace. Not the absence of grief. Samuel would always remain part of the ache inside her heart. But grief no longer felt cold or empty anymore. It felt connected to love now. Connected to every frightened animal healed within the sanctuary. Connected to every lonely visitor who found comfort beneath the trees. Connected to every laugh echoing softly through the cafe at sunset. Eleanor finally understood that loss had not destroyed her son's dream. In some quiet and unexpected way, it had planted it. Noah glanced toward her after a moment. "What are you thinking about?" Eleanor smiled faintly while staring toward the old bicycle glowing beneath the lantern light near the garden. Just how strange life can be, she answered softly. For years, I thought I was alone out here. Her eyes drifted slowly across the sanctuary one final time. Families gathering beside the café porch. Volunteers carrying fresh feed toward the shelters. Children laughing beneath the pine trees while rescued rabbits darted through the grass nearby. The wolf resting peacefully beside the fence as evening settled over the forest. Eleanor wrapped both hands around the warm tea mug and smiled through quiet tears shining in her eyes. But maybe, she whispered gently into the evening air, broken things simply find each other.